Welcome to the lab. Today, we're going to be building a set of keepsake boxes to hold a couple of pens, pencils, and journals. I mark my faces off with some chalk, that way I visually can tell where the joiner blades have made contact with my material. This board was fairly tweaked, so it required multiple passes to get a nice flat face. Once I've joined and planed 3 faces, I can bring the stock over to the table saw and rip the 4th edge. Time to cut the dados. When cutting thin dados, I like to use a table saw blade that has a flat tooth. That way, there's minimal cleanup. Here, I'm setting the depth of my dado to a line that I had scribed on the side of the board. Once my dados are cut, I can bring my stock over to the thickness sander and remove any of the tear out. When setting angles on the table saw, I like to use these digital angle gauges. I find them to be incredibly accurate. The interior dimension of this box is very important. In order to achieve the perfect measurement, I cut off one end and use a ruler and mark my interior dimension. Once I have my line, I can set up a stop block on the table saw to make repetitive cuts. The length and width of my box are different sizes, so I'll have to estimate the width now and readjust my stop block in the future to trim those down. Here I'm adjusting the side length and trimming the other 2 pieces down. Time to prep the stock for the top. For the top, I've opted to use Mahogany since it pairs nicely with the Lacewood sides. Once I've joined and planed my stock, I bring it over to the bandsaw to resaw. That way I'll have matching grain on my top panel and my bottom panel. I've also opted to have the grain continue between both the boxes. That way they become more of a unit rather than individual pieces. Now you don't want your panels to be too tight. You want to allow for expansion and contraction in the future. Once I've cut my panels slightly undersized, I can do a dry assembly to make sure everything fits nicely. For this box, I've opted to include a reveal around the top. This won't only serve as a visual element, it'll also help with expansion and contraction in the future. Once I know the size of my top, I can set my blade using a setup gauge block as well as an offcut from the side. Once I've cut the reveal on my top, I can head over to my workbench and do a second dry assembly. Now I'm marking off for the divider panel. I'm going to cut my dado using a V-groove bit since that'll complement the mitered edges nicely. I've decided to cut the V-groove using the bridge port since it is far more accurate than the router table and also a lot safer. In order to have a 1/4 inch divider, I have to cut the depth of my V-groove exactly 1/8 of an inch. Once that operation is done, I can go and tweak my pieces before my final glue up. Before I glue everything up, I like to run a quick interior sand to get rid of any oils left from my hands or the bridge port. I also add some paste wax in all the places I anticipate there to be some glue squeeze out. This will make it a lot easier to clean up in the future. In order to get a nice reveal, I've cut some shim stock that'll hold the panel exactly where I want it while the glue dries. Once I've let the box dry overnight, I can remove the tape and take a look at the corners. Now it's time to split the top from the bottom. The way I like to do this is on the table saw. I'll set the height of my blade just shy of the thickness of the sides. That way, there's no unwanted tear out in the center. Once I've cut the sides with the table saw, I can go back with a hand saw and complete the cut. Once that's done, I can go to town with a little hand plane, removing any of the unwanted stock. Once that's done, I can start working the inside of the box. Here I'm removing the glue squeeze out as well as refining the V-groove. Since my joinery of choice for this box was mitered corners, I have to include some splines. When including splines on a detailed box like this, I like to use a handsaw since it has a smaller kerf than the table saw blade or bandsaw. When cutting splines by hand, it's important to let the saw do the work. If you try to force the direction of the saw, you'll end up with a wavy line. The most challenging part about making thin splines is preparing the stock. I cut my stock down on the bandsaw, then refine the thickness with a hand plane and sanding block. Once the splines are the appropriate thickness, I can break them to length and glue them in. In gluing in the splines, I take great care to make sure there's glue on both sides. Also, I make sure the splines are well seated. Once the splines have had the opportunity to dry, I bring the box over to the disc sander and belt sander to clean them up. Of course, this can be done with a sharp hand plane or chisel. If you choose to use a power tool, make sure you take small passes, since you don't want to change the overall size of the box. This will lead to issues when you fit the top to the bottom. Here I'm marking the center of the box divide. Once I have the center, I can bring the stock over to the disc sander and work down to that point. I take multiple small passes and check it on the box regularly. Since it's difficult to get the pens and pencils out, I've decided to include a slot for your finger. When drilling through the stock on the drill press, I go through about 90%, flip the stock, and remove the remaining material. That way, I won't have any blowout on the other side. I continue my lines up and remove the excess material using a handsaw. Once the majority of the stock is removed, I can use an oscillating sander and a belt sander to clean up the edges. Once the divider is sanded, I can go ahead and glue it into the box. Time to set the hinges. When choosing hinges, I like to go with a high quality hinge since there is less side-to-side movement, which is really noticeable in a small box like this. The way I set my hinges is I'll double stick tape the hinge down, score a line around it, and remove the bulk of the material with a trim router. Once that's done, I could use a chisel and remove the rest of the material. Once I've set the bottom, I can move on to the top, and the way I do that is I'll line the top up with the bottom and continue my lines from the hinges up to the top panel. That way, if there's any discrepancy in the placement, it won't be noticeable once the top's on. Once my hinges are installed, I can go ahead and sand my box. I like to sand with the hinges installed since I can tell exactly where the top and the bottom meet. Once I've sanded through my grits, I use a little hand plane to break the edges. I'll also break the edges inside, which will create a nice little reveal around the box. Once that's done, I go ahead and remove the hinges so I can sand where I was unable to reach. Once the sanding process is almost done, I use some denatured alcohol and an acid brush to remove the paste wax I put on the top and corners earlier. Once I give the denatured alcohol the opportunity to dry, I'll use some water and a rag to raise the grain. Raising the grain before I put my first coat of finish really helps, since I can knock down the fibers now instead of doing it after I've applied my first coat. Once the water's dry, I use 400 grit and sand all the surface to get rid of the raised grain. Once I've thoroughly sanded the box with 400 grit, I can move over to finishing. Time to apply the finish. For the finish on this box, I've decided to use Armor Seal's General Finish, since it is an extremely durable finish and I anticipate these boxes being handled regularly. The way I apply my finish is with a foam brush and a rag. I like using a foam brush when there's corners since it's a lot easier to get in there with the chisel tip rather than a rag. Once the finish is applied, I use an air gun to blow out any of the finish that has settled in the corners and the top groove. After letting the first coat dry overnight, I do a quick scuff sand before I apply the second coat. After waiting overnight for the second coat to dry, I can go ahead and put the third and final coat on the box. For the third and final coat, I forgo using the foam brush since it tends to apply a lot of finish. Instead, I use a bulb rag and put a very light top coat on. That way there won't be any sanding once the third coat's dried. Once the third coat has had the opportunity to dry, I move on to final assembly. When screws are visible on a project, I like to use flathead screws since I like the way they look over Phillip head screws. Since small brass screws have a tendency to break, I use screw wax to help prevent breaking. When installing slotted screws, I take the effort to make sure that all my screw heads are clocked. Once my hinges are installed, I can go over the surface with a rag and some feed and wax to really bring the shine into the finish. The final step of the build is installing some press-fit knobs. When installing the knob, I use a drill bit that's slightly larger than the diameter of the knob. That way, there's room for super glue to get all the way around. And that's it, a box to hold a couple pens, pencils, and journals. We'll see you next time in the lab.